The first wave came at 0347, Private First Class. Thomas "Tommy" Kendrick heard them before he saw them, the rustle of vegetation, the clink of equipment, the soft rhythm of men moving through jungle darkness. He pressed himself deeper into his foxhole and waited. He was alone on Hill 109. The rest of his squad was dead. It was June 19th, 1944. Saipan. The Marines had landed 4 days earlier, and the fighting had been brutal from the first hour. The Japanese had fortified every ridge, every hill, every patch of high ground on the island. Taking them required blood, American blood, paid out in quantities that made veteran sergeants go pale. Hill 109 wasn't much of a hill, maybe 60 feet of elevation, covered in scrub brush and volcanic rock, but it overlooked the approach to the airfield, and whoever held it controlled the ground below. Artillery spotters on that hilltop could call fire onto anything that moved. Machine gunners could sweep the approaches clean. It was terrain that mattered, and terrain that mattered had to be taken. The Marines had taken it that afternoon. Kendrick's squad, 12 men under Sergeant Pete Holloway, had crawled up the eastern slope under mortar fire and cleared the Japanese positions one by one. Grenades first, then rifles, then bayonets when the grenades ran out. It had cost them 4 men to reach the top. It had cost them 4 more to hold it through the first counterattack at dusk. Now there were 4 left: Holloway, Kendrick, and 2 others, Rodriguez, and a kid from Minnesota named Larson. Then the mortars had started falling. The barrage lasted 20 minutes, Japanese 81mm mortars, walking their fire across the hilltop with methodical precision. The shells came down in groups of 4, each group slightly displaced from the last, until the entire position had been saturated with high explosive. When it stopped, Kendrick was the only one still breathing. He had been in his foxhole when the first round landed. The hole was deep. He had spent an hour digging it with his entrenching tool, ignoring the blisters on his palms, because Sergeant Holloway had taught him that a deep hole was worth more than body armor. The shells had exploded around him, showering him with dirt and fragments, but the hole had held. The others hadn't been so lucky. Rodriguez had been moving between positions, trying to redistribute ammunition. A direct hit had caught him in the open. Shrapnel had taken Larson as he dove for cover. Holloway had been checking the perimeter when a shell landed 3 feet behind him. Kendrick had watched Holloway die. The sergeant had looked at him with something like surprise. Not fear, not pain, just surprise that it had happened so quickly. Then he had slumped forward and was still. Now Kendrick was alone. 22 years old, a former automobile mechanic from Scranton, Pennsylvania, with a Browning automatic rifle that had taken shrapnel damage in the barrage. A fragment had bent the operating rod. Not badly, but enough. The weapon would fire, but it wouldn't cycle automatically anymore. Every shot would require him to manually work the action, a 20-round magazine, 1 shot at a time. And somewhere in the darkness below, at least 200 Japanese soldiers were preparing to take back the hill. Kendrick checked his ammunition: 6 magazines for the BAR, his M1911 pistol with 2 spare clips, 4 grenades, a Ka-Bar knife that his father had carried on Guadalcanal before a Japanese bullet sent him home missing 3 fingers. Not enough. Not nearly enough. But it was what he had. The rustling grew louder. Kendrick could see them now, shadows moving through the darkness, filtering up the slope in a loose skirmish line. They weren't charging yet. They were probing, testing, trying to determine what resistance remained on the hilltop. Smart tactics. The mortar barrage had been designed to soften the position. Now they were checking to see how soft it had become. Kendrick let them come. His grandfather had been a coal miner in the anthracite fields of northeastern Pennsylvania. Hard men, those miners, men who went into the darkness every day and came back out through sheer stubborn refusal to die. His grandfather had survived 3 cave-ins, 2 explosions, and 40 years of breathing coal dust. The mountain always wins eventually, the old man had told him once, but you can make it work for every inch. Kendrick intended to make the Japanese work for every inch. He waited until the first soldier was 30 yards away, close enough to see clearly in the darkness, close enough to guarantee a hit. Then he raised the BAR, sighted carefully on the center of the man's chest, and fired. The rifle kicked against his shoulder. The Japanese soldier pitched backward without a sound. Kendrick worked the action. Pull, release, chambered the next round, and fired again. Another soldier fell. The skirmish line hesitated. In the darkness, they couldn't tell how many Americans were on the hilltop. They couldn't see that it was just one man with a broken weapon. All they knew was that accurate fire was coming from the crest, and their men were dying. Kendrick fired again, worked the action, fired, worked the action. 4 shots, 4 dead Japanese, 16 rounds remaining in the magazine. The skirmish line broke. The soldiers scattered into the brush, seeking cover, trying to locate the source of the fire. Kendrick could hear their officers shouting orders in Japanese, harsh, clipped commands that carried clearly through the night air. They were reorganizing, preparing for the next push. He had maybe 5 minutes. 5 minutes to prepare, 5 minutes to think, 5 minutes to consider whether he should try to retreat, to slip down the back of the hill and make his way to the American lines. He dismissed the thought almost immediately. Retreat meant abandoning the position. Abandoning the position meant the Japanese would retake the hill. Retaking the hill meant they would have observation over the American advance, would be able to call artillery onto the Marines below, would be able to turn every yard of the approach into a killing ground. Sergeant Holloway had died taking this hill. Rodriguez and Larson had died holding it. Kendrick wasn't going to let their deaths mean nothing. Besides, there was something else, something deeper, something that had nothing to do with tactics or terrain or the strategic value of Hill 109. His father had told him about Guadalcanal, not the details, never the details, but the feeling, the moment when a man had to decide whether he was going to fight or run, the moment when everything he thought he knew about himself was tested against the reality of combat. "You'll know when it comes," his father had said, "and when it does, you'll find out who you really are." Kendrick knew who he was. He was a coal miner's grandson and a Marine's son. He was a man who fixed things that were broken. He was a man who didn't run. Kendrick used the time to redistribute his magazines, placing them within easy reach around the lip of his foxhole. He checked his grenades, loosening the pins for quick release. He drew his pistol and set it beside him, safety off, ready for close work if it came to that. Then he thought about what he was facing. 200 men, maybe more. He had counted perhaps 30 in the skirmish line, which meant there were at least 6 times that many waiting in the jungle below. 6 waves if they came in equal strength. 6 waves, and he had ammunition for maybe 2. The math was simple. The math was brutal. The math said he was going to die on this hilltop. But the math didn't account for the bent operating rod. The math didn't account for the fact that the Japanese thought they were facing a defended position, not one wounded Marine with a broken rifle. The math didn't account for the confusion and the darkness and the fog of war. The math said he was going to die. Kendrick intended to prove the math wrong. The second wave came 7 minutes later. This time they came faster, rushing up the slope in a loose formation designed to minimize casualties from aimed fire. They were screaming now, that high-pitched battle cry that the Marines had learned to dread, the sound of men who had accepted death and were running toward it. Kendrick had heard the cry before. On the beach, when the first Banzai charge had hit the Marines still struggling through the surf, in the cane fields, when Japanese soldiers had erupted from hidden positions with bayonets fixed. It was meant to terrify, to paralyze, to break the will of the enemy before the killing started. Kendrick didn't feel terror. He felt something colder, something harder, something that his grandfather would have recognized from the darkness of the mines. He picked his targets carefully, the leaders first, the officers and NCOs who were directing the attack, identifiable by their swords and their positions at the front of the formation. Then the soldiers with automatic weapons, the light machine gunners and the submachine gunners who could lay down suppressive fire. Then anyone who got too close. Fire, work the action. Fire, work the action. The bar was never designed to be operated this way. It was meant to lay down suppressive fire, 20 rounds in quick succession, keeping enemy heads down while other Marines maneuvered. The Marine Corps had built its small unit tactics around the automatic rifle, using it as the base of fire that allowed riflemen to advance. Using it as a single-shot rifle was like using a sledgehammer to drive finishing nails. It was inefficient, awkward, and slow, but Kendrick made it work. He had spent 2 years as an automobile mechanic before the war, working in his uncle's garage on the outskirts of Scranton. Carburetors, transmissions, engines that should have been junked years ago, but kept running because people couldn't afford new cars. He had learned that machines didn't care about should or shouldn't. They cared about what was. The bar shouldn't function as a single-shot rifle. The operating rod was bent. The action wouldn't cycle. By every reasonable standard, the weapon was combat ineffective. But Kendrick's hands knew what to do. Pull the operating rod, release, chamber the round, fire. The motion became automatic, a rhythm that his body learned and his mind followed. Pull, release, fire, pull, release, fire. 12 shots, 12 hits. The attacking wave faltered, stumbled, broke apart as the men in front went down and the men behind tripped over their bodies. Men were screaming in the darkness, wounded men, dying men, men calling for medics who would never come. Kendrick ejected the empty magazine, slammed in a fresh one, waited. He was sweating now, despite the cool night air. His shoulder ached from the recoil. His fingers were cramping from working the bent operating rod after every shot. But he pushed the pain aside, the way his grandfather had pushed aside the pain of black lung and broken bones. The mountain always wins eventually, but not yet. Not tonight. The third wave came 4 minutes later. They were learning now. They came from 3 directions, trying to divide his fire, trying to find the gaps in his coverage. Japanese officers had identified the source of the firing, a single position on the crest, and had adjusted their tactics accordingly. Kendrick pivoted in his foxhole, engaging targets on the left, then the right, then the center. He was moving constantly now, shifting his aim, tracking multiple threats at once. The bar swung in short arcs, spitting fire in controlled bursts of 1. Fire, work the action. Fire, work the action. A bullet cracked past his head, close enough that he felt the wind of its passage. Another struck the lip of his foxhole, spraying dirt into his eyes. The Japanese had spotted his muzzle flash and were returning fire, trying to suppress him, trying to keep his head down while their assault closed the distance. Kendrick ignored the incoming fire. He couldn't afford to duck, couldn't afford to take cover, couldn't afford to give them even a few seconds of respite. Every second he stopped shooting was a second they got closer. Fire, work the action. Fire, work the action. His shoulder was bruising from the recoil. His hands were cramping from working the bent operating rod. His eyes burned from the muzzle flash in the darkness, the brief flare of light that destroyed his night vision with every shot. But he kept shooting. The wave broke. The survivors retreated down the slope, dragging their wounded with them. Kendrick could hear the officers screaming, not battle cries now, but anger, frustration, confusion. They still didn't know it was just one man. Kendrick checked his ammunition. 3 magazines left, 60 rounds, and somewhere below, nearly 200 Japanese soldiers were regrouping for the next assault. He was going to run out of bullets before they ran out of men. The mathematics of the situation were inescapable. 3 magazines, maybe 40 more kills if he made every shot count. And there were at least 150 soldiers still alive on that slope, still ready to attack, still determined to take back the hill. The numbers didn't work. The numbers said he was already dead, but Kendrick had never been good at math. He had been good at fixing engines, good at finding the problem when everyone else said the car was junk, good at making things work when they shouldn't work, when the parts were worn and the tolerances were shot, and the whole machine should have been scrapped years ago. The bar shouldn't work, not with a bent operating rod, not firing 1 shot at a time, not against 200 men, but Kendrick was going to make it work anyway. He thought about what his grandfather would say. The old man had died in 1941, 3 months before Pearl Harbor, his lungs finally giving out after decades of coal dust. But his voice was still there, still clear in Kendrick's memory. The mountain doesn't care how many men you bring. The mountain doesn't care how strong you are. The mountain only cares whether you're willing to pay the price. The Japanese were willing to pay the price. They had already paid with dozens of dead. They would pay with dozens more. But Kendrick was willing to pay too, and his currency was stubbornness. The 4th wave came at 04:23. This was the big one. Kendrick could tell by the sound, the sheer volume of movement, the weight of bodies pushing through brush, the coordinated shouts of officers directing a full-scale assault. They were done probing. They were done testing. They were coming to take the hill, whatever the cost. In the pre-dawn darkness, Kendrick could see them massing at the base of the slope. Not 30 men this time, not 50, Over 100 soldiers forming up for a single overwhelming assault. They had rifles and bayonets and grenades and light machine guns. They had numbers and momentum and the terrible weight of a force that knew it could not be stopped. Kendrick rose from his foxhole. He didn't know why he did it. Tactical doctrine said to stay low, use cover, minimize exposure. Rising from cover in the face of an assault was suicide. Every training manual, every sergeant, every lesson he had ever learned told him to stay down. But something in him, something his grandfather would have recognized, something that came from generations of men who had faced the darkness and refused to bow, refused to die in a hole. If he was going to fall, he was going to fall standing up. He planted his feet on the volcanic rock, raised the bar to his shoulder, and started shooting. Fire, work the action, fire, work the action. The Japanese came screaming up the slope. Kendrick shot them. They kept coming. He kept shooting. Fire, work the action, fire, work the action. A bullet snapped past his ear, so close he could feel the heat of its passage. Another tugged at his sleeve, punching through fabric without touching skin. A third grazed his thigh, drawing blood but hitting nothing vital. He didn't stop. He didn't take cover. He just kept shooting. Fire. Work the action. Fire. Work the action. The magazine ran dry. He dropped it, slammed in another, kept firing. In the growing light, he could see their faces now. Young men, mostly. Some no older than he was. Their eyes were wide with adrenaline and fear and something else, something that might have been recognition. Recognition that the man on the hilltop was not going to run, was not going to hide, was not going to do anything except stand there and kill them until they killed him. Fire, work the action. Fire, work the action. Japanese soldiers were falling all around him now. Some were hit by his fire, spinning and dropping as the heavy .30-06 rounds tore through them. Others were stumbling over the bodies of the fallen, losing their footing on the blood-slick rock. The attack was losing cohesion, men bunching up, getting in each other's way. Kendrick's second magazine ran dry. He loaded his last one. 20 rounds, maybe 40 men still coming up the slope. He made every shot count. Fire. Work the action. Fire. Work the action. 15 rounds left. 30 men still coming. 10 rounds. 25 men. 5 rounds. 20 men. The magazine clicked empty. Kendrick dropped the BAR and drew his pistol. 7 rounds in the magazine. 1 in the chamber. The Japanese were 20 yards away. Close enough that he could see the fear in their eyes, the doubt that was creeping in as they watched their comrades fall. He shot the first man through the chest. The impact knocked the soldier backward, and the man behind him stumbled over the body. Kendrick shot him too, then the next, then the next. 4 rounds left, 15 men. 3 rounds, 12 men. 2 rounds, 10 men. The fourth wave broke. Kendrick couldn't believe it. They were so close. Close enough to overwhelm him with sheer numbers, close enough to end this with bayonets, but something in them cracked. Maybe it was the sight of one man standing alone on the hilltop, shooting them down like the angel of death. Maybe it was the bodies piled on the slope, the cost already paid, the uncertainty of how many more would die before they finally took the hill. They ran, and Kendrick stood on the hilltop and watched them go. His pistol was almost empty. His BAR was empty. He had 2 grenades left and his K-bar knife. But the Japanese were retreating down the slope, leaving their dead and wounded behind. He had held the hill. For a long moment, he stood there, swaying slightly, unable to believe what had happened. 4 waves, 4 attacks. Over 100 men had charged up that slope, and he had stopped them all. The adrenaline was fading now, replaced by something else. Exhaustion, maybe, or shock. His legs felt weak, his arms like lead. The BAR dangled from his right hand, the bent operating rod still warm from the firing. In the growing light, he could see his hands. They were bloody, not from wounds, but from working the action. The metal had torn at his palms with every cycle, and he hadn't even noticed. The pain was there now, a dull throb that seemed very far away. He thought about Holloway, about Rodriguez and Larson, about the 8 men who had died taking and holding this hill. They should have been here to see this. They should have been here to share in whatever this was. Victory, survival, the simple stubborn refusal to die. But they weren't. They were gone, and he was alone, and the Japanese were retreating down the slope. The sun was starting to rise. In the growing light, Kendrick could see what he had done. The slope was covered with bodies. Japanese soldiers in their mustard-colored uniforms, some still moving, most still forever. He tried to count them and lost track somewhere around 30. Later, when the relief force arrived, they would count 67 dead on the slope and the hilltop, another 40 wounded who had been dragged away during the retreat, over 100 casualties inflicted by one man with a broken rifle. But that was later. Right now, Kendrick was alone on Hill 109, swaying on his feet, bleeding from a wound he hadn't noticed, surrounded by the dead. He sat down heavily on the volcanic rock. His hands were shaking. His whole body was shaking. He had held the hill. The relief force found him 3 hours later. A platoon from Fox Company, pushing forward to reinforce the position, crested the eastern slope, expecting to find Japanese soldiers. Instead, they found one Marine sitting on a rock, staring at nothing, surrounded by enemy dead. The smell hit them first, blood and cordite, and the first sweet hints of decay in the tropical heat. Then the sight, bodies everywhere, sprawled across the volcanic rock, tangled in the scrub brush, piled at the lip of foxholes they had never reached. The Marines of Fox Company were veterans. They had landed on D-Day, had fought through the cane fields and the ridgelines and the fortified caves. They had seen death in quantities that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. But they had never seen anything like Hill 109. "Jesus Christ," someone whispered. "What happened here?" Lieutenant James Kavanaugh was the first to reach the lone survivor. He was a veteran of Guadalcanal, a man who had seen more than his share of death and destruction. But even he stopped short at the sight that greeted him. Bodies everywhere, stacked 3 deep in places, blood soaking into the volcanic soil, shell casings scattered across the hilltop like brass confetti, and in the middle of it all, one Marine with a broken BAR and a pistol with 2 rounds remaining. "Jesus Christ," Kavanaugh said. It wasn't profanity, it was prayer. Kendrick looked up at him. His eyes were distant, unfocused, the 1,000-yard stare that Kavanaugh had seen on too many faces, the look of a man who had been somewhere that other men could not follow. "They kept coming," Kendrick said. His voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. "They kept coming, and I kept shooting." "How many?" "I don't know. All of them, I think. All of them I could." Kavanaugh looked around at the carnage, tried to count the bodies, gave up somewhere around 40. "You did this? Alone?" Kendrick didn't answer. He just stared at his hands, the bloody, torn hands that had worked the operating rod 100 times that night. Kavanaugh knelt beside him, saw the blood soaking through the leg of his dungarees, saw the tremor in his hands that wouldn't stop. "Corpsman!" he shouted. "Corpsman up!" He would later write about the moment in a letter to his wife. "I've seen a lot in this war. I've seen men do things that should have been impossible. But I've never seen anything like what I saw on Hill 109. The Japs were stacked 3 deep in places. One man did that. One man with a rifle that barely worked. When I asked him how he did it, he just looked at me and said, 'I made them work for every inch.' I still don't know what he meant. I don't think he knew either." Kendrick was evacuated to a field hospital that afternoon. The wound on his thigh was worse than he'd realized. The bullet had nicked the femoral artery, and he'd been slowly bleeding out since the 4th wave. The doctors told him later that another hour on that hilltop would have killed him. He didn't care. He had held the hill. Word spread quickly through the division. A Marine on Saipan, alone on a hilltop, 200 Japanese soldiers, 67 confirmed kills. The numbers seemed impossible. The stories that came back from the survivors seemed impossible. But the evidence was there on the slope of Hill 109, and the men who counted the bodies didn't lie. The Marine Corps awarded Kendrick the Navy Cross, the second highest decoration for valor in the service. The citation mentioned extraordinary heroism and complete disregard for his own safety, and actions in keeping with the highest traditions of the United States Naval Service. It didn't mention the broken bar. It didn't mention the hours of pulling the operating rod after every shot. It didn't mention the moment when he rose from his foxhole and decided to die on his feet. Citations never mention things like that. The war continued. Saipan fell after 3 weeks of brutal fighting, with the Japanese garrison fighting almost to the last man. The Marines moved on to Tinian, then Guam, then the long bloody road that led to Iwo Jima and Okinawa and the doorstep of Japan itself. Kendrick didn't go with them. His wound had damaged the muscles in his leg badly enough that he was evacuated to Hawaii, then to San Diego, then home to Scranton. He walked with a limp for the rest of his life. A reminder, he said, of the night he spent standing on a hilltop when he should have been lying down. He went back to work as a mechanic. The work came easy. Engines and transmissions didn't care about the war, didn't care about Hill 109, didn't care about anything except being fixed. He found peace in the work, in the simple satisfaction of making broken things run again. Sometimes, when he was working on a particularly difficult engine, he would think about the BAR. The bent operating rod, the manual cycling after every shot. He had made that broken weapon work when it shouldn't have worked, had kept it firing through 4 waves of Japanese infantry, had killed 67 men with a rifle that any armorer would have condemned. He had kept the bar. Not officially. Officially, it had been turned in for repair or replacement. But the armorer who received it had been a friend of Holloway's, and he had understood. He had reported the weapon destroyed by enemy action and handed it back to Kendrick wrapped in a poncho. The rifle sat in his closet for 50 years. Sometimes he would take it out, work the bent operating rod, feel the familiar resistance that had saved his life. He never fired it again. He didn't need to. The memory was enough. He married a girl named Dorothy who worked at the Five and Dime on Lackawanna Avenue. She had red hair and freckles and a laugh that could fill a room. She didn't ask about the war, and he didn't tell her. That was the arrangement, and it worked. They had 3 children, then 6 grandchildren, then 11 great-grandchildren. Kendrick watched them grow, watched them go off to their own wars, Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, and prayed that none of them would ever have to do what he had done. He never talked much about Saipan. When people asked, and people always asked, once they saw the Navy Cross in its case on the mantel, he would shrug and change the subject. What was there to say? He had done what needed to be done. Other men had done more. But sometimes, late at night, when Dorothy was asleep and the house was quiet, he would take out his father's Ka-Bar knife and turn it over in his hands. His father had carried it on Guadalcanal. Kendrick had carried it on Saipan. The blade was still sharp, still clean, still ready. He had never needed to use it that night on Hill 109. The bar and the pistol had been enough, but he had been ready to. He had been ready to fight with his hands, with his knife, with his teeth if it came to that. The mountain always wins eventually, but you can make it work for every inch. His grandfather had said that about coal mining, about the endless struggle against rock and darkness and the weight of the earth itself. But Kendrick had come to understand that it applied to more than mining. It applied to war, to life, to the simple act of refusing to give up when every rational calculation said you should. The Japanese had thrown 200 men at that hill. They had attacked 4 times, with rifles and grenades and bayonets. They had come screaming through the darkness, ready to die, ready to kill, and one Marine with a broken rifle had made them work for every inch. He had never thought of himself as a hero. Heroes were men who did extraordinary things because they were extraordinary people. Kendrick had just done what needed to be done, the same way his grandfather had gone into the mines every day, and his father had fought on Guadalcanal, and his uncles had worked the steel mills until their bodies gave out. You did what was in front of you. You didn't run. You made them work for every inch. Thomas Kendrick died in 1997 at the age of 75. He was buried in Cathedral Cemetery in Scranton with full military honors. His Navy Cross was placed in his hands before the casket was closed, the way Marines had been buried since the earliest days of the Corps. Dorothy followed him 2 years later. The family said she died of a broken heart, which was the kind of thing families said, but which might have been true anyway. The obituary in the Scranton Times-Tribune mentioned his service in the Pacific, his decoration for valor, his 67 confirmed kills on a hilltop called Hill 109. It mentioned his wife and his children and his grandchildren and his great-grandchildren. It didn't mention the broken bar. It didn't mention the hours of working the operating rod by hand. It didn't mention the moment he rose from his foxhole and decided that if he was going to die, he was going to die standing up. Obituaries never mention things like that. But the men who fought with him remembered. The men who found him on that hilltop remembered. And the story passed from Marine to Marine, from generation to generation, until it became part of the Corps itself. A legend of one man, one broken rifle, and a hill that would not fall. Today, if you visit the National Museum of the Marine Corps in Triangle, Virginia, you can find a small exhibit dedicated to the Battle of Saipan. There is no mention of Thomas Kendrick by name. His action was one of hundreds of heroic stands that marked that brutal campaign. But there is a Browning automatic rifle on display, an M1918A2, the same model Kendrick carried. The placard beneath it explains how the weapon was designed to be used. Automatic fire, suppressive fire, the base of fire around which Marine infantry tactics revolved. It doesn't explain how one Marine used it on a hilltop in 1944, one shot at a time, working the action by hand, holding a hill against 200 soldiers. Visitors walk past the display every day. Most of them don't stop. Most of them don't know what that rifle represented, what it could do in the hands of a man who refused to give up. But sometimes a veteran will pause. Sometimes an old Marine, his hair gray and his back bent by years, will stop in front of that display and stare at the BAR for a long time. Sometimes he'll reach out, almost unconsciously, and make a motion with his right hand. Pull, release, the ghost of an action that saved his life, or the life of someone he knew, or the life of someone who knew someone who knew someone. The story lives on, passed from Marine to Marine, from generation to generation. Not in any official history. Official histories are full of unit designations and terrain features and casualty figures. But in the stories that Marines tell each other, the stories that matter, some things can't be explained. They can only be remembered. And in the long history of the Marine Corps, in the long roll call of men who held their ground when they should have run, who stood and fought when they should have died, Thomas Kendrick's name is written. Not in any official history, not in any monument or memorial, but in the stories that Marines tell each other, late at night, when the talk turns to what it means to hold a position, what it means to never give up, what it means to make the enemy work for every inch. That's where Kendrick lives now. In the stories, in the legend, in the spirit of every Marine who has ever looked at an impossible situation and decided to fight anyway. The Japanese threw 200 men at Hill 109. They threw everything they had. They attacked 4 times, and 4 times they were beaten back. By one man, one Marine, one broken BAR. Some hills are too stubborn to fall. If this story moved you, make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell. These stories of individual courage deserve to be remembered and shared. Drop a comment below. What would you have done in Kendrick's position? Would you have stayed in the foxhole, or would you have stood up to face the enemy? And if you haven't already, check out our previous video on the Battle of Saipan, the larger context for this incredible story of one Marine's refusal to give ground. Until next time.